There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to the B2B Growth Show, a podcast dedicated to helping B2B executives achieve explosive growth. Whether you're looking for techniques and strategies or tools and resources, you've come to the right place. I'm James Carberry.
And I'm Jonathan Green.
Let's get into the show. Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. We are here today with Dr. Jason Selk. He is the best-selling author of 3 books, Executive Toughness, 10-Minute Toughness, and Organize Tomorrow Today. 10-Minute Toughness is actually on pace to be one of the best sports psychology books of all time. So Jason, I'm really excited to chat with you today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, James. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So one of my dear friends, Anton Andreessen, saw you speak at a conference with, I think, over a dozen other speakers. And, he said, hands down, you were the best speaker at the conference, and it had a profound impact on his life. So whenever you said yes to being on the show, I was over the moon. So we're going to be talking about a few different things today, but it's all kind of centered around this idea of mental toughness. And so you were the former mental training director for the St. Louis Cardinals. And as I was talking with Anton before the interview, he said, man, you've got to get Jason to share his story of how he became the mental training director for the St. Louis Cardinals. So, Jason, I would love for you to give us a little bit of background, and then if you could jump into that story, I think that would be incredible.
Yeah, I'll just jump right into the story. So this was back in December of 2005. Walt Jocketty, who at the time was the general manager for the Cardinals, he's now over in Cincinnati, but Walt reached out to me and asked if I'd be willing to help the players and coaches of the Cardinals develop mental toughness needed to win a World Series. It had been a 20-plus year drought for the Cardinals at that point in time. And the way Walt and I put it together, I was to, in March of 2006, start with the team down in the spring training complex, take a week, and in that week at spring training, every morning, I was to do a 2-hour presentation with the players and coaches and then be available for any additional attention that any one of the players or coaches might want. And then for the remainder of the 2006 season, I was to be available approximately 20 hours a week to work with any of the individuals, again, wanting that individual attention. And so this is my very first day on the job, March 19th, 2006. I think it was a Tuesday morning. It was about 8:15 in the morning. The first presentation with the team was to start at roughly 8:45 that morning. And I was up in Walt's office, and Walt looked at me and said, "Do you want to go meet Tony La Russa?" And I thought it was a little odd that I hadn't met Tony La Russa. But this was really my first opportunity with the team, so I was really just going with the flow. Walt walks me in Tony's office, and Tony's in his uniform, working on some paperwork behind his desk, and Walt walks me in and says, "Tony, this is Jason Selk. He's going to do the sports psychology for the team this year." And Tony La Russa barely looks up. I don't even think I get eye contact. And he goes right back down to working on what he was working on. And then I notice there's this weird, awkward silence in the room where Tony won't look at me, and now Walt won't even look at me. I'm kind of feeling there's definitely something off with what's going on here. And after a minute or so, Tony stands up, he walks around his desk, and as he's walking by me, I don't even think he breaks stride, barely looks at me, says these words, "You have 10 minutes. And I'm thinking, well, actually, I've got a contract that says, I'm going to be here for 2 hours with you and then available all day to work with the individuals. And we do that for a week. And then you've got me all year about 20 hours a week. And in that moment, I start thinking about the contract. And I knew that I had seen space at the bottom of the contract for 2 signatures. But I could only recall in that moment seeing that contract with 1 signature, my signature. Now, I'm no attorney. Okay, but I can put together pretty quickly that's probably not a binding contract if mine's the only signature on it. And I also realize, okay, I don't think I have a job at the St. Louis Cardinals. I think I have an interview. It's a 10-minute interview. And so I think, okay, I better make this count because I've told just about everybody I can get to listen back in St. Louis, and I'm the new director of sports psychology. So I walk in the clubhouse. That's where the presentation is to take place. And if you go back to 2006, I mean, the Cardinals were a very veteran-rich club. So imagine, I'm standing in front of them, a complete nobody, just at this point fighting for a chance, fighting to get through this interview and get a job with the team. You've got all the players are in their uniforms sitting on stools in front of their lockers. You got all-star third baseman Scott Rowland, Jim Edmonds, David Eckstein, Chris Carpenter, just coming off the 2005 Cy Young, a new pitcher on the team, Adam Wainwright. You've got Yadier Molina, Albert Pujols, and the list of players goes on. And then they had the 4 coaches were seated about 10 feet in front of where I was presenting. You had former first base coach Dave McKay, third base coach Jose Kendo, pitching coach, probably greatest in my mind, greatest pitching coach of all time, Dave Duncan, and then obviously Tony La Russa. And I start the presentation this way. I say, originally I thought I had 2 hours with you all. I've just been notified I have 10 minutes. What I was going to cover with you is something called the mental workout. Mental workout is a 5-step process, something I developed a few years back that has since been scientifically proven to put you in a position to play better baseball more consistently. I won't have time to cover all 5 of the tools in the mental workout, but I will have time to cover one. I launch into the first tool, the first step of the mental workout, something called a centering breath. And I finish that, and I realize I've been up there for about 8 minutes at this point, and I don't want to press my luck with Tony La Russa, so I ask if there are any questions. And I don't know if people can relate, but you've probably seen, movies, they make fun of it, where you're standing up there, you ask a question, and there's just that silence. It's work silence, the crickets chirping.
Yep.
And that's what goes on in my head. It's deafening. And then thankfully, Dave Duncan, and this is, by the way, why I consider him greatest pitching coach of all time, but Dave Duncan raises his hand and says, would you teach the second tool of the mental workout? And I look at Tony La Russa, and Tony gives me the nod, and so I move into the second tool of the mental workout, something called a performance statement. Performance statement is really a very specific and individualized level of focus.
Okay.
If you look at the research on focus, what you'll find is for most people, it's really not specific or individualized. It's somewhat general, and unless it's specific and individualized, focus is just absolutely irrelevant. So people, when you say get focused, they don't know specifically what to focus on, so again, it doesn't do them any good. And in fact, if you look at the research, even when you look at the leadership, whether it be the head coach or the boss, and you try to figure out what are you coaching the person to specifically focus on, they can't even give you the specifics necessary for focus to become relevant.
Interesting.
With the players I work with, and when I was with the Cardinals, I wanted to make sure that every player was very specific and very clear on what to focus on. That's what the performance statement does. It forces each player during competition to realize what those 2 or 3 most important items that if they focus on will cause them to play most optimally. It's the performance statement. So I finish the second tool of the mental workout, the performance statement, and again, ask if there are any questions. And again, crickets chirping, silence. Thankfully, this time doesn't go on quite as long. And then our third baseman, Scott Rowland, he raises his hand and says, would you teach the third tool of the mental workout? I look at Tony, and Tony gives me the nod, and so I move into the third tool of the mental workout, something called a personal highlight reel. Personal highlight reel is an advanced form of visualization that once we identify specifically what each player wants to focus on during competition, then we have them spend 3 minutes a day visualizing themselves only focused on those items. What it does is it really takes focus from a pep talk to a very trained skill. It gives players that I work with, players with the Cardinals at that point in time, a real edge in consistency. And now I finished teaching that third tool, the mental workout, and Chris Carpenter, again, he had just been awarded the 2005 Cy Young. He stands up, takes maybe 4 or 5 steps forward, so he's closer to the center of the room, and he says these words: "Everybody better pay attention, because this is what it takes for us to take it to the next level." And I'm up front thinking, oh my gosh, what a gift I'm just given. It's like when the light comes down from the ceiling and you hear the ball. So anyway, I was back that very first day, March 19th, lucky enough where Tony allowed me to stay and work through all 5 tools of the mental workout. And then he asked if I would work with some of his players and coaches individually that day. And then he asked me back for a second day and a third day and every day that week. And then in 2006, I was able to spend about 20 hours a week working with players and coaches. And in 2006, the St. Louis Cardinals win their first World Series in a 24-year period of time.
Wow.
And then I was lucky enough, the organization asked me back for 2007 and 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, in which time we won our second World Series in a 6-year period.
Wow. And
I stepped down as director of sports psychology for the Cardinals after the 2011 World Series victory. But I know that I was really fortunate to have those 6 years with the team, because it gave me an opportunity, obviously, to be kind of behind the curtain, behind the scenes with one of the most successful organizations in all of Major League Baseball.
Yeah. No, that's a phenomenal story. I mean, the fact that in your first year they win the World Series, your first and your last year they win the World Series, I think is such sweet icing on that cake. I want to circle back to that performance statement, the second tool that you referred to there, Jason. A lot of the folks listening to this are, they're marketing leaders, they're, a CMO or a VP of marketing, they're leading kind of the marketing effort in their organization. Can you share kind of more specifics? Like, what do those performance statements look like? You mentioned honing in on kind of the 2 or 3 deliverable results that each person is supposed to be following through with, and then crafting the statement around there. Can you share some of those statements just to give us an example?
Sure. Yeah. And again, you have to kind of think, what are the activities you're focused on here? In sports, I think it's quite easy to put the performance statement together, because in sports, you don't have necessarily the magnitude of tasks that most people in the business world need to be focused on to have a certain level of success.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you're a pitcher, there's no doubt the number one most important thing you need to be focused on is pitching the ball.
Yeah.
Now, certainly you have to also play some defense, and if you're in the National League, you have to hit, but there's no doubt those pitchers are being paid to pitch.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll give you an example of a performance statement for a pitcher. Okay, so this is a very, very successful guy, had a very, very successful career in the major leagues. When he was on the mound, he really forced his mind to focus on 3 things: weight back, arm on top, pound down. And now this was a taller fella, so what that did was it caused him, by keeping his weight back, it really caused him to create a significant amount of power. And then the arm on top, what that means is he's really just, when he's throwing the ball, he's trying to have an arm slot that's really high up in the air, which if then he couples it with the pound down, it created an angle of the ball, even with just fastballs, with pitches that weren't making a lot of movement, made it very, very difficult for a hitter because of the high angle of the release and the fact that he was pounding on the angle down. It made it hard for the hitter to do anything but hit ground balls if they were going to make contact. All right, so again, for a pitcher, for this particular pitcher, it was weight back, arm on top, pound down. Now, for somebody in the business world, again, it's a little bit more difficult because it's harder for us, I think, because we have so many different tasks. All right, now, you have to think to yourself, first and foremost, what's my most important task?
Yeah.
If you're a person like me, the most important task is either, I basically have two things that are the most important. Number one, if I'm doing a speech, I got to think about how I'm going to deliver the speech. So it's the speaking aspect, or the other task might be I'm also a coach. I do if I'm not on the road traveling speaking, I'm usually working all day doing individual coaching with people, whether they're in the business world or athletes.
Got it.
And I might identify a performance statement for each of those two tasks. So, for example, as a speaker, I know for me, my performance statement is smile, take it slow, attack. Right now, let me just explain. I have a tendency as a speaker, I can get caught up in just being all business. And I realize that if I go up there and I'm all business, a lot of people, they're at conferences, and some of them are incentive-based conferences. They're not necessarily there to do extremely hard work.
Yeah.
With me, I think I've made a career on really just outwork the competition, be more prepared. So I have to remember to go up there and make this fun for people, that it's not necessarily a very intense work day for them. That's what Smile does. It just reminds me to don't take yourself so seriously, relax just a little bit. Let's have some fun with this.
Yeah.
All right. Take it slow. I think any really good speaker has learned the importance of using pauses, slowing the pace down, so that the listener can stay connected, not get lost. So that's what take it slow means for me. And then attack, really just the heart of the matter, again, that's the easy part for me is, hey, look, we're going to have some fun with this and we're going to take it slow. But in the end, I have a job to do, and that's if somebody's in the stands, I have a job to make sure they walk out of there with at least one thing of concrete value that they can use to go make their lives better immediately. And that's what I'm going to attack, is making sure that I attack the content and attack so that they know this is important. And if you do this, your life's going to get a little bit better.
Got it.
Right now, again, the performance statements, James, must be specific. And I tell you, the rule is you cannot have more than 3 items. I won't go into detail of why, but it comes down to what your brain's bandwidth. It's called channel capacity. The ability of the brain to manage multiple concepts really starts to be handicapped after 3. So when you're coming up with a performance statement, make it very individual for you. Start by just coming up with one performance statement for your most important task, and never more than 3 items, and you don't even have to have all 3. If you want to just come up with the 2 most important things or the single most important thing, that would be fine as well. So those are some quick guidelines on the performance statement.
Got it. And so the performance statement is per task. So if you've got a marketer on your team that is juggling a lot of different tasks, you don't want to. So say we're talking to a chief marketing officer and they've got a team of 20 marketers on their team. Should they be prescribing these performance statements, or should they be empowering their team to come up with their own performance statement for each of the tasks that they're tasked with doing?
That is such a great question. And the answer is, I think it's always better to empower the individual to come up with their own performance statement. Right now, I'll say this, because if you think about, let's again use baseball. The head coach oftentimes has more experience than any one player out there. And especially if you're very good at what you do, I think oftentimes the head coach might know some ideas, some things you might want to consider. So I think it's a good idea if you're if you're in leadership and marketing and you're overseeing a group of people, don't be afraid to suggest, hey, if it were me, this would be for you what I would consider your 2 or 3 most important things. And I might even say, if I were in charge of doing your job, this is what I would come up with as my performance statement. But all that's really just for brainstorming purposes. I want you to tell me what you think your 2 or 3 most important items are, that if you focus on these 2 or 3 most important items, it will put you in a position to perform most optimally in this most important task.
Got it. So if they have 3 or 4 primary tasks that they're responsible for, is having 3 to 4 performance statements, is that okay? Or does that kind of dilute the power in it if you have that many?
That's another really, really good question. I'm really sensitive to this channel capacity. I think it's one of the biggest mistakes people make in the sports world, but obviously even more so in the business world, that we're trying to overload what people can handle mentally and physically, for that matter, especially these days. So what I would do is I would just start with one performance statement. I would make sure that if I was running an organization, I would make sure that my people knew every day what their 3 most important tasks were, and of the 3, which is the one most important task that absolutely must get done. And it'd be the one must task. That's what I would make sure that people had a performance statement for.
Got it.
I think some people might be able to handle coming up with a performance statement for 2 or 3 different tasks. But there are going to be plenty of people who can't handle that by making them come up with performance statements for multiple tasks, they are going to compromise the ability and the execution on the one most important.
Yeah.
And I know even in business, this is one of the things that I get hired most often to help people with, is just really getting zeroed in on nailing that one most important task each and every day. And as simple as it sounds, if people would go out and just nail the one most important thing each and every day, the success of any organization, any team, for the most part, I've never seen it that wasn't a significant positive impact.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, I would make it somewhat mandatory that we had one task identified, the one most important activity each and every day. And for that task, what are the 2 or 3 most important things to focus on? And then let them know, hey, look, if you want to come up with performance statements for some of the others, feel free. But we're going to just make sure that this one is done and executed at the highest level possible daily. Then we'll worry about what comes next. Everything after that is really just somewhat icing on the cake.
Got it. This last point that I want to touch on, Jason, before I let you go today, it's related to what we were just talking about, but it's this concept you call relentless solution focus. Can you touch on this idea for us before I let you go?
Sure. Relentless solution focus, RSF, is really what I consider to be the number one measure of mental toughness. And I'm going to give you the definition quickly for RSF.
Okay.
It is the mind's ability to focus on solutions, especially in the face of adversity or problems. All right, now, let me explain. There's a couple of things I think people really need to be aware of how the brain works. Number one is something called PCT. It's the opposite of RSF. PCT is problem-centric thought. Now, the bad news is, biologically, we're all built in a way that PCT is totally normal. It's biologically ingrained in every single one of us. It's totally normal to focus on the negative or the problem, and it's fairly abnormal to focus on solutions. And let me give you an example of PCT.
Okay.
The most valuable resource known to our species is oxygen. But when is the last time you thought to yourself, James, as you take a breath, wow, this is awesome. I've got this awesome life.
Yeah.
Access to the most valuable resource known to my species.
Yep.
My guess is you haven't had that thought, nor have I, recently.
Nope.
That's PCT. All right, now compare that with, though, when's the last time you thought to yourself, I don't have enough money. I don't have enough love. I don't have enough respect. I don't have enough, you fill in the blank.
Yep.
You see, that's how the brain is built, to focus on the negative. It's totally normal. Right now, the second thing I think is really, really important is something called expectancy theory.
Okay. Expectancy
theory is really the root of all psychology. And here's your definition for expectancy theory. That which you focus on expands. Right, so you have to understand, people out there in an organization, if you're overseeing a group of 20 people, you need to know this, that those 20 people, their brain is built that it's completely normal to focus on the negative, on the problem. And by doing what's completely normal, they will create more negative, more problems for themselves and for the team. Yep. Right now, what RSF does is, first of all, it's capitalizing on what we know from science, that although PCT is hardwired, we know it's neuroplasticity. Some of the things that are hardwired can actually be rewired with training. One of those things, you can learn to rewire to get rid of the PCT and replace it with the RSF, that it becomes much more normal for people to focus on solutions. And now to do that, though, again, requires some training. The first step in the training is you must educate people on just the concepts, that PCT, what it is, and that it's normal.
Okay.
You need to be able to also identify for people when they're focused on problems, because as simple as it sounds, it's very difficult for us to know when we're doing it because it's so biologically ingrained. Now, human beings, I found, are actually pretty good at identifying when other people are focused on problems, but self-assessment is much more difficult. And you have to understand that we were given as humans a built-in alarm system that tells us every time we're on that problem side of the board. And the built-in alarm system is negative emotion, stress, anxiety, fear, anger, depression, guilt. See, human beings, we do not possess the ability to experience those negative emotions unless our brain is focused through the PCT lens, focused on a problem. Unfortunately, we've been kind of told as a society that this negative emotion, it's a curse, and we should do anything in our power to avoid it. That's crazy, James. You have to understand how scary that is.
Yeah.
Negative emotion is not a curse. It's actually a gift. It's the gift of recognition that says, hey, you're focused on the wrong stuff. Okay, now the good news is that negative emotion then manifests itself. It grows in intensity so that it motivates us to make some changes. But the faster you can recognize, like for me, I know anytime I experience stress, I know what's going on here. I'm focused on a problem. I know to get into my head and start with my thoughts. That gives me an advantage on most people. All right, now that's step one, is just being able to identify when you are focused through the PCT lens. Now then, you have to start working on how do you shift from the negative, from the PCT to the RSF? How do you get to the solution? And it's a simple question that if you'll force yourself to answer, anytime you experience negative emotion, force yourself to answer this question and come up with an answer. I don't know is not an answer. Come up with an answer, even if it's crazy or harebrained, it will shift biologically what's going on. That instead of now having these negative neurotransmitters that make you feel like garbage and also significantly limit your intelligence, you now start to release neurotransmitters that make you feel a lot better, and they enhance your intelligence. And the question is, what is one thing I can do differently that could make this better? Again, you catch yourself with a negative emotion, quickly say, okay, I got to get control of my thoughts, and then here's the question then. Okay, so what's the one thing I can do differently that could make this better? And if you force an answer, again, I don't know is the opposite of an answer, so that doesn't qualify. Anything other than I don't know, or anything that symbolizes I don't know, anything other than that counts. You come up with a solution, come up with an answer to that question, and you've now shifted your mind over to the solution. As simple as it sounds, that's what gives, and it's total science, people a significant enhancement in health, happiness, and success. In fact, scientifically proven, people with RSF live up to 14 years longer than normal people.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, that question I think is so powerful. What is, anytime you catch yourself focusing on a problem, just asking yourself, what is one thing I could do differently that could make this better? Just forces you into a place of you're constantly coming up with solutions instead of harboring on what's wrong. So that one takeaway for me, Jason, was incredibly valuable. This entire interview has been incredibly helpful. I could see why Anton loved your talk as much as he did. If there's somebody listening to this, Jason, that wants to stay connected with you, maybe they want to find your books or just learn more about you, bring you into their organization, what's the best way for them to go about doing that?
I think the best way is probably through my website, which is jasonselk.com. I know, and I hear this a lot, and it means a lot to me. We do try to put one thing a day on social media. So we put just one quick message a day on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm not sure if we're on Instagram. Frankly, I give them the content and they push it out there. Yeah. But I think, and again, we're not trying to hide. So if you're a Facebook person, Jason Selk. If you're LinkedIn, Jason Selk. Twitter, I think it's all just Jason Selk or Dr. Jason Selk, but I think Jason Selk could probably get you there. If you want some of that information, we'd love to push that out. And again, we're not going to overload anyone. We're just going to try to give you one small little piece each day to help you work on your mental toughness.
I love it. Jason, well, thank you so much for your time today. Again, this has been incredibly helpful for me. I know our listeners are going to love it as well. So I appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate you having me, and all the best to the people out there listening. If there is ever anything I can do to help, please reach out. We love to try to make an impact on people's lives.
To ensure that you never miss an episode of the B2B Growth Show, subscribe to the show in iTunes or your favorite podcast player. This guarantees that every episode will get delivered directly to your device.
If you'd like to connect with B2B executives from all over the world, make sure to join our private Facebook community. There are some incredible conversations happening inside this group. To join, visit b2bgrowthshow.com/FB.
Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.